The culmination of the textus receptus argument and its final overthrow, the final stroke, we could say, at the antiquated TR, was left for two professors of divinity by the name of B.F. Westcott and F.J.A. Hort at Cambridge University in England. Brooke Foss Westcott, B-R-O-O-K-E-F-O-S-S. Brooke Foss Westcott, or if you want the British pronunciation, Westcott. I believe they would call it Westcott instead of Westcott. They don't draw everything out and pronounce it like we do. But anyway, Brooke Foss Westcott and Fenton John Anthony Hort, H-O-R-T, generally simply known as Westcott-Hort, Westcott and Hort, or Westcott and Hort, because the names just go together. Westcott lived 1825 to 1901. Hort happened to have been a former pupil of Westcott's, as well as the famous Bishop Lightfoot, known for many of his works of the early patristic writers and his notable commentaries on books like Colossians and Philemon and so forth, which, by the way, are worth having. If you don't have some of Lightfoot's works, some of his commentaries on the Pauline epistles in the New Testament. It was the plan of Westcott, Lightfoot, and Hort to write a complete commentary on the whole Bible. This plan never materialized, although Westcott kept up his end of the deal by writing a commentary on the Gospel of John, the epistles of John, and the epistle to the Hebrews, all of which I have and which are worth having. You have to know something about Greek because they're written in Greek. He gives you the Greek text as the basis of his comments on that. Westcott succeeded Lightfoot as Bishop of Durham in 1890, died in 1901, but above all of his commentaries that he's done, he's best known for his work on the New Testament canon and the New Testament text. I have a copy here of the 6th edition of his book, printed in 1855, a general survey of the history of the canon of the New Testament, which even to this day is still the standard text on the canon of the New Testament. Obviously, this is a newly printed copy of the 6th edition. There you see his name down at the bottom, Brooke Foss Westcott, B.F. Westcott. Written in 1855, this is what he's generally known for, his work in textual studies and the text and the canon of the New Testament. The New as opposed to the New and the Old, or just the Old by itself. If you have the book, or if you've ever read it like I have, even my wife's read that, she's way ahead of all y'all in your readings because I require her to keep up with everything, and she's already read for classes we haven't even gotten to. So you can ask her what her complaints are about B.F. Westcott and the way he writes in that book. So to satisfy people who didn't have the depth that he did, he printed in 1866, and this is an original copy of the book, a book entitled The Bible in the Church, which was just a popular revision of his more scholarly The General Survey of the History of the Canon of the New Testament. So you know how old this is if it was printed in 1866. That generally is what Westcott is known for, his work in the canon, the text of the New Testament. On the other hand, we have Fenton John Anthony Hort, who lived 1828 through 1892. It's generally agreed, although many people have never even heard of Hort, people have heard of Westcott and they've heard of Lightfoot. These three men met at Cambridge, where they all taught at one time or the other and became best friends for life. And although people have heard of Lightfoot and Westcott before, few have heard of Hort, yet at the same time it's generally acknowledged that Hort was the more brilliant of the three scholars. As a matter of fact, some people have said that he was so brilliant, he had such a great slant towards perfectionism and everything that he wrote, he had to make sure he was precise and perfectly right in what he wrote. That's why he didn't write anything. And we have no books of his down to the day. He wanted to be so perfect that he never got around to writing anything. Which is the way I feel sometimes about teaching. You know, I want to be so right about it, I just never get around to doing it. But I confess I'm going to be better than Hort. Live longer or work hard or whatever. By the way, it's acknowledged that Hort died mentally exhausted. That's what caused his death. It was through mental exhaustion from his study and from his work. He needed to take time out to speak in tongues and praise the Lord, which he didn't do because he didn't have the baptism. Now, I think there's a great purpose in the baptism, speaking in tongues. Whenever you get into these deeper things, you have to know these things to really know the Word of God, but they can just dry you up like a leaf on a fall tree. So it's good to speak in tongues in between your times of study. But anyway, he had such a tendency towards perfectionism. He published very, very little. A couple of pamphlets, I guess, came from his pen, but we don't have any of his major works around. So how do we know he was so brilliant? Well, one thing, he never wrote anything. He was that smart to realize don't write anything until you are certain that you are certain about what you're going to say. That's the honest truth. That's the honest truth why I haven't gotten around to teaching on lots of different things. Not only because we don't have time, yet anyway, it's just because I want to be certain that I'm certain before we get to that. Hallelujah. So anyway, another reason why we know that he was so brilliant was because in the 2-volume book that Westcott-Hort wrote and published in 1881 and 1882, entitled The New Testament in the Original Greek, the first volume contained the text of their critical studies of the New Testament in the original Greek, and then the second volume contained their introduction to their work as well as an appendix. The introduction was 57 pages long, just in detailing the principles of TC that were employed by Westcott-Hort in their book, The New Testament in the Original Greek, and that was written by Hort. As a matter of fact, from what I remember, the entire second volume was written by Hort, so it's really not just a book that he's published on his own, but it goes together with the work that he had spent 28 years with Westcott in preparing. As a matter of fact, they began working in 1853 together, and as I just said, this book was published in the years 1881 to 1882, entitled The New Testament in the Original Greek. Here they give us the text of what they feel to be as close as can possibly be attained, the original autographs of the New Testament. And then, as I said, in their second volume, they go into much discussion of their principles that they have employed in coming about with this text. In 1881, the English Revised Version was published, and the revisers on this committee of the ERV, two of which were Westcott-Hort, but the revisers were given a little sneak preview of the work of Westcott-Hort before it was actually made available toward the end of 1881, and the beginning of 1882. We'll get back to the ERV later on. It's a very interesting English version, and it's known as the English Revised Version. But since the book really came out a few months later, towards the end of 81, where I think the ERV came out in the spring of 1881, then the revisers on the committee of the ERV were given a sneak preview of what the principles were of Westcott-Hort and what they felt the original New Testament Greek really to be and really to say. And of course that version, if you have the ERV, which I have, or a copy of it, or a recent edition or whatever of it, if you've got that and look up passages in it and compare them to the KJV, you'll find out that they are quite a bit different in quite a few places. Now, their names, I said, I believe in ending last week's teaching, rank with Tischendorf in being important in critical studies, and I want to give you several things that contributed towards the lasting greatness of the publication of their book, The New Testament in the Original Greek, because it's still the book that's consulted down to this day, and although modification has been done in the area of some of the principles of Westcott-Hort, nevertheless, their principles remain the cornerstone, the foundation of pretty much all textual principles and studies today. so that people continually refer back, if not to a specific example, at least to the idea behind the example of what Westcott and Hort gave. So why has their book lasted, or their books, 2 volumes, lasted so long and contributed so much? Well, in the first place, you have to remember that their work was not new, their work was not original. It's based upon the studies and the volumes written by men who came before them. We've mentioned Bengel and Wettstein and Simler and Griesbach and Lockman and Tischendorf and Tregelles and a lot of others who had some hints at a genealogical theory for the families of New Testament manuscripts, as well as just a whole lot of other things, such as the canons of textual criticism. Some of those we've mentioned before. So it's not like no one has ever heard of this before, and Westcott and Hort just burst on the scene saying, now this is the way it's going to be from now on, because if that were the case, generally that would be hard to receive by most people. People think of the KJV as being a very important and widespread version of the Bible, and it is. But it took years to overthrow the Great Bible, which was the Bible that was used by most people, which came before the KJV. The KJV wasn't just published and printed in 1611, and everyone just went out and bought a copy and thought this is the Bible that's going to last for the next 300 years. No, it simply wasn't the way it happened then. The KJV was something that was a little bit different than the versions that had come before, and it took the people a little while to get used to it. But this is really not the case with Westcott and Hort, since their work is built upon the foundations laid by others. It's just they're the ones who culminate the process. Then in the second place, another thing that's contributed to their lasting importance and greatness and their work's preeminence is the use of it by the ERV. When you've got a major translation and version of the Bible based specifically upon some books by authors of their day, then that's going to elevate them to the limelight right away. Because with most of the versions, that's not the case. They've gone back and considered a whole lot of different things. But with the English Revised Version, it's based for the most part primarily upon the New Testament in the original Greek by Westcott and Hort. So, to the extent that the RV of the island of Great Britain is going to be used, and so would the principles, the work, and then the books, the 2 volumes of Westcott and Hort. The third place, we can mention the thoroughness of their critical explanations. Some before, remember Lockman that we mentioned before, Lockman, who was not a theologian, he was a classical scholar, and he, we said last week, was the first one to completely break away from the TR by giving us a text that was based solely upon the principles of textual criticism. And Lockman evidently was so naive or whatever, we don't know, he didn't even explain to scholars in his work why he did what he did, not until the second edition came out. And that's what made scholars so upset with him, was that he had the audacity to depart from the revered TR and yet not explain why he did that. So this is not the case with Westcott and Hort, although a lot of present-day staunch supporters of the KJV would try to make Westcott and Hort look like 2 critical scholars who don't believe in the deity of Christ and a whole lot of other things. That's just really not the case. They have their own problems theologically, just like a lot of people do today. Supporters of the KJV, who have their own theological problems today. But they were very thorough in their critical explanations of what they did and why they did it. And then finally, unlike the volumes and the works of most scholars, their volumes were easy to read by the general public, and they were printed and published without a cumbersome CA that we've talked about in the past that generally is stuck onto the end of the work that no one cares to look at because no one can understand it, no one can read it, except maybe a few scholars who major in that field. So those are probably some of the things that contribute towards the lasting remembrance of the names Westcott and Hort. How many of you have ever heard of Westcott and Hort before you came to this church? Well, just a few of you then. Maybe they're not so lasting in remembrance of some people. But if you do any studies at all, then obviously they're the names that come up right away. So before we get into what their theory is, let's give a little review of what we've said thus far about the TR, because we want to try to sum everything up that we are going to say about Textus Receptus this evening. So maybe it would be best just to have it kind of all summed up together in one night's notes, so you won't have to patchwork it together over the next few days. Okay, in the first place, we gave a teaching several weeks ago concerning the standardization of the Byzantine text that took place from the 4th to the 8th century A.D. after Constantine moved his capital from Rome to Constantinople. Now, do you remember us talking about that? The standardization of what we call the Byzantine text type that lasted from the 4th to the 8th century A.D. And we've said that at least in part the TR is based upon the Byzantine text. Not entirely, because earlier we told you what the Textus Receptus was, and we called it a mixed Byzantine text type, which means it's not totally based upon the standardized Byzantine text from the 4th to the 8th century. Okay, I think the next thing chronologically that comes in order is the Second Rabbinic Bible, published in the years 1524 to 1525 by Daniel Bomberg and edited by Jacob ben Chaim, Chayyim, where we said under this that much of the Old Testament of the Textus Receptus is based upon the critical work contained in the Second Rabbinic Bible. Obviously, the Second Rabbinic Bible has to be based upon something itself. But yet there are certain times when certain translations or additions or revisions come forth that just crystallize in a way that's not been done before the text that's going to be used thereafter. And this was the case with the Second Rabbinic Bible. Then, in the third place, we mentioned Erasmus, the Dutch humanist, who gave us at least 5 editions of the Greek New Testament. The third of 1522 and later a 5th edition were the important ones for the TR. But yet under this you might also want to list some of the other names that we mentioned under the printed text of the Greek Bible, such as Cardinal Francisco, Jimenez de Cisneros, and his Complutensian polyglot, because some of what Erasmus did in his 4th and 5th edition, his 4th edition and then his 5th based on his 4th, was based upon the work that was done by Jimenez in the Complutensian polyglot. Remember that the Pope didn't allow Jimenez to actually publish his work until 1522, the same year that the 3rd edition of Erasmus came out. So Erasmus didn't have time to see his before his 3rd edition was already out. So by the time he gave us his 4th and 5th edition, he had had time to go back and look at Jimenez and what he had done in the Complutensian polyglot and base some of his work on that. So you've got, first of all, really, you would have Jimenez in the Complutensian polyglot that would come before Erasmus. Then you've got Robert Stephanus, and in that message we showed you how each one of these writers was basing some of his work on the one who came before him. That's why they really all have to go together, although in the past we've just isolated Erasmus by himself. So Robert Stephanus, his work was based upon the work of Erasmus. Theodore Beza, B-E-Z-A, his work was based upon the work of Stephanus and Erasmus. And then Abraham and Bonaventure Elzevir, who were brothers involved in printing. Some books refer to him as an uncle and as a nephew. Most of them refer to him as 2 brothers. It doesn't make a lot of difference. We still know their name and we know what they did. They gave us about 7 editions of the Greek New Testament. The one that's important for our studies is the second one of 1633 that gave us in their preface the little statement that we've quoted to you before. You have now therefore the text received by all, the received text, the textum receptum or the textus receptus. And that's where the little catchphrase originated, in which they said we've given nothing corrupt, nothing altered, which is an impossibility, to say that you've given everything originally as it was given by the early apostles. And then, we're not going to go through all of last week's message, but then last week we had names such as Bingel, Johann Bingel, we had Wettstein. All of these were working towards the culmination under Westcott-Hort. Johann Salomo Simler, Lockman, Tregelles, Griesbach, Tischendorf, Alford. I think those covered some of the major names we mentioned last week. And so then that brings us up to, you see, this has gone all the way from the 4th century up until now the end of the 19th century, 1881 to 1882, with Westcott-Hort. Now I want to try, it's very, very confusing to get into it in very much detail, because a lot of it is conjectural work, a lot of it is what they call conjectural emendation, where you really don't have a proof of what could be or could not be in a place where you've got the absence of a letter or a mark over a letter that you need in the Hebrew Old Testament or Greek New Testament, which you simply supply in yourself. And a lot of it's ambiguous because so much of what is said really we don't know definitely, because we don't have people talking back in the 4th and the 5th and the 6th century about textual criticism. So we have to go back and try to find that ourselves. So I want to try to give you in an amended form the theory of Westcott-Hort, the theory that really has changed the ideas of critics, the ideas of Bible translations since it was first known or first made so popular in 1881 and 1882. You see, if you look at versions and translations of the Bible since that time, you'll find that they deviate from the KJV quite a bit. The vast majority of them deviate quite a bit. Why? Because of Westcott-Hort and their 2-volume book that was printed in 1881 and 1882. So it's important to know something of their theory that they use to give us the principles in refuting the KJV, or not just the KJV, but the Textus Receptus. What they felt was that the manuscript versions and quotations fell into 4 genealogical categories. Now, so far, 3 men before them, 3 men that we know of before them, Johann Bingel, Johann Simler, Johann Griesbach. They were all Johann. John was a popular name in Germany, as it still is in America today. Bingel, Simler, and Griesbach were 3 men so far that we know of who came before Westcott-Hort, who also adopted a slightly smaller scale form of the genealogical theory that was later expanded and crystallized by Westcott-Hort. By that, we have reference to the different families of manuscripts. Under Bingel, Bingel felt that there were 2 families of manuscripts. The African family, we mentioned all of this last week, and the Asiatic family. Now, Bingel was the first one to recognize the groupings of manuscripts, the genealogical families or groupings or categories of manuscripts. That, I think, was back in 1734. I don't have a date down here, but you can go back in last week's notes and get that. Then a little bit later, I think around 1764, Simler comes on the scene, Johann Salomo Simler, who expands Bingel's grouping from 2 to 3, from African and Asiatic to the following 3: Alexandrian, Eastern, and Western. You see, this is showing you right away that the work of Westcott-Hort was not original. They've already gotten the idea from at least 3 men who came before them. And then a couple of decades later, Griesbach, with his 3 families, the same as Simler, but he renames one. Alexandrian and Western stay the same. He renames Eastern the Byzantine family. So he stays with 3 families. He stays with the same 3 families and simply renames one. That's a couple of decades after Simler. Just put 1800. That should be in your notes. I can find the notes and give you a specific year. 1774 to 1806, so 1800 was a good guess. So So the theory, the foundation for the theory of Westcott and Hort is nothing new. It's been seen and been demonstrated by Bingel and Simler and Griesbach before, that the versions and the quotations fall into categories, genealogical families or categories. But notice I gave you the number of them, 4. So for the first time now we've got 4 as opposed to the 2 or the 3 that came before Westcott and Hort. And these are the 4. The Western, we'll come back and make a comment or two about each one of them. Of course, they just go on pages and pages about each one of these that we really don't have the time to do. I think that we can still give you what you need to know and come to right conclusions by just summing these things up. Alexandrian, the Syrian, and the neutral. Western, Alexandrian, you might want to leave some space between them so we can make a comment or two about them. Western, Alexandrian, Syrian, and neutral. Now these are simply their ideas, their opinions. Some of them make sense, some of them have afterwards been proven to be not entirely reliable and have been put away and something else added in. For the Western family, they felt that the Western text type was manifested in the following Greek uncials: Codex D05, Codex D subscript 206, Codex Delta, and Codex Theta, which if you know your Greek symbols, you simply abbreviate because that's the way that they're written. Now these would be proponents of the Western family. Then a handful of minuscules, the Old Latin version, which is why they gave it the name Western, is because it was manifested in the Old Latin version, which was, Latin was the language of the western part of the empire, as well as most fathers, most Latin fathers from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. So that, combined with the fact that it's manifested in the Old Latin version, is why they gave the name Western to this group. Now they felt that in this group, variants crept into the New Testament at a very early stage in this Western group and were soon perpetuated as the daughter copies were taken from the parent copies. Now whether 05 or 06 was a daughter copy or a parent copy would really be impossible to tell, except that they felt that regardless of whether it's parent or daughter, you're going to have a few errors, a few variants that have crept into the New Testament at a very, very early stage. Then in the second place, their Alexandrian family. They named it Alexandrian because it seemed to bear witness with the manuscripts that were found in Egypt. Hence the name Alexandria as being the important scholarly city of the country of Egypt. Now they refer to the Alexandrian groupings of manuscripts as a less distinct group. And what they mean by that is it's really hard to name the uncials or the minuscules or whatever that would go into this. It's just that we know that we've got a different type of variants because we've got a different family in which they're found. But they do give us a couple. Codex C and Codex L are felt to be Alexandrian, as well as the Sahidic version of the Bible. Now they liked the Alexandrian family because they felt that Alexandria, or they knew that Alexandria was a city of literary acumen, and thus the only changes that the New Testament manuscripts would have would probably be stylistic ones, rather than ones that were changed for theological purposes or ones that were changed because the scribes were not as adept as they might have been in another place. Because of the literary and the scholarly acumen of a city like Alexandria, they felt that you're going to have very great manuscripts, a very good family that would come from this area. And then you can put a note there. We haven't gotten to the neutral, but it's very, very similar to the neutral family. It probably came out of the neutral family, or the neutral family came out of it. So you would tie Alexandrian and neutral families together. Then in the third place, there's Syrian family. It was their theory under the Syrian family that after Christianity obtained official status in the Roman Empire, in the 4th century A.D., an attempt was made to standardize the text, to smooth out the variants, and that this attempt towards standardization was supposedly done in the country of Syria. It's real close to Constantinople, so they're in the same ballpark, at least, as being on the eastern part of the Roman Empire. In the Syrian family, which is going to be essentially the same as the Byzantine family, Eastern Empire, the eastern part, the Eastern family, they just gave it a different name and felt that the standardization attempt was done not at Constantinople, but was done probably at Antioch. It's also known as the Antiochian family, but it's generally referred to, at least under their writings, as the Syrian family. But Antioch would be the chief city there. So the Syrian family comprises the vast majority of the minuscules, most of the later versions, most of the later fathers, and most of the later uncials. So the Syrian family comprises the vast majority of the minuscules, most of the later versions, most of the later fathers, and most of the later uncials, including the following: A, E, F, G, H, S, V, and Z. A, E, F, G, H, S, V, Z. They felt were later uncials that would be dated later than the earlier uncials, and that would fall under the Syrian family. Then finally, their neutral family. Now, the neutral family was the smallest family, the smallest group, but yet at the same time it contained the greatest two uncials, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which they felt to be very, very similar to each other. And remember, we said a moment ago that they joined together the Alexandrian and neutral families as one having originated from the other. So obviously, since Alexandria is in Egypt, they also felt that the neutral family probably originated in Egypt as well. Now, although it's been difficult for them or for anyone else to explain, their claim concerning the neutral family was that this group somehow escaped corruptions of the text, most notably the variants, of the other three groups, and thus was able to preserve the original text. So obviously their favorite family would be the neutral family, followed by Alexandrian, followed by Western, and rounded out by Syrian, which was the Byzantine family. Now remember, I'm summing up there. They worked 28 years on this, so I worked not even 28 minutes on it. Well, I guess we've been going a half hour, but not a half hour on their theory. So there's always the cry, well, you don't do justice to something like that, when really you can, if you can give the essential breakdown of the names of their families and tell essentially what they felt about those families and what they meant by what they said. And that is essentially what I've just given you. This is what they felt was to exist regarding the families, and what they felt was to exist underneath the families. You've got the Western that contains Greek uncials, a few minuscules. It's based on Old Latin version and the quotations from the Fathers, which would come from the Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire, which would put it over in Italy, which would make it the Western family. It all makes a lot of sense. Alexandrian family, that one doesn't make a whole lot of sense because there's not a lot you can say about it, because they say it's just a less distinct group of manuscripts. It's a group that's really hard to put a name tag to or find manuscripts that would completely fit under this family. By the way, one interesting thing that you might want to put as a footnote rather than a side note, because it doesn't go just with Westcott and Hort, but just because a manuscript in the Gospels is placed under, let's say, the Western family, doesn't mean that the Pauline epistles will also be of the Western text type. As a matter of fact, a lot of times you find it spread out among 2 or 3, or I guess rarely, among 4 of the families, where the Gospels will come from something, Acts will come from something else, then Revelation will come from something else, and then the Pauline epistles. There's 4 right away. Or if you don't have the Pauline, then you've got the general epistles, and maybe you'd have the general epistles and maybe Acts that come from the same family, and then you've got the Apocalypse and maybe the Gospels and maybe the Pauline epistles that come from 1 or 2 other families. So you'd get it spread out, which means it's going to make it just that much more difficult to say anything definite about that manuscript, because it looks like it's come from the text type of different families, and probably it has. So that, in essence, is what their theory was. It might not sound like a lot, but it was a lot, because no one had really broken it down into these 4 families and then had told us what they meant by these families, and then had given us a revision in the Greek of the whole New Testament based upon their work. Now, reaction to it was no small thing. Reaction began immediately to the Westcott and Hort theory, led primarily by a group of several men that I'll give you their names here in a moment. But not only are these men important, their works became important, because even down to this day, as I'll be showing you here in a moment, the reaction against the Westcott and Hort theory is based upon the books of these men. Really not a lot has been said since then in favor of Textus Receptus and KJV, except people who have an emotional, sentimental hang-up for the KJV that really don't give us any reasons why, except sentimentality and emotionalism, which they wouldn't confess to. They try to give us some facts, but I'll read you a paragraph of what a fellow says about those facts here in a moment. So, in the first place, we've got George Salmon, S-A-L-M-O-N, 1819 to 1904. These were the 3 men who were most involved in the immediate reaction against Westcott and Hort's theory. George Salmon, 1819 to 1904. Then F.H.A. Scrivener, who probably was the better of these 3 in the area of his theological and scholarly work, 1813 to 1891. But the best known of the 3 is J.W. Bergen, 1813 to 1888. Famous, powerful scholar, and his books concerning, he wrote a whole book, 500 pages or so, on the revision of the Revised. He said it's time now, since the English Revised Version revised the KJV, let's revise the Revised Version back to the KJV. So he wrote a famous book called The Revision of the Revised, or The Revised Revision, I think was the name of the book. He wrote a book on the last few verses of Mark chapter 16, proving how it was valid and true and should be kept in the Bible, although people like Westcott and Hort were taking it out because it wasn't found in some of the manuscripts that they used. We're not going to get into that. We've already discussed that before. Now, they gave us 3 arguments, or all of their arguments can be summed up under 3 arguments of Scrivener, Bergen, and Salmon that they felt were valid against Westcott and Hort theory. And you listen to the arguments. In the first place, they tell us for 1,500 years, this is the old antiquated view here, that age brings veneration. For 1,500 years, the church had followed the TR. That is, from the 4th century up until the 1900s. For 1,500 years. And by the way, what was the church following for the first 3 centuries before there was a Byzantine text? Wasn't even standardized until, or wasn't even began towards the process of standardization until the middle of the 4th century A.D. And that's one problem with his whole theory about Textus Receptus and the KJV. But anyway, we'll leave that alone for a moment. For 1,500 years, the church had followed the TR. They claimed that God would not have allowed his people to be deceived for so long. Well, that's the same argument used by the Roman Catholic Church. That we couldn't be wrong, or God wouldn't have allowed all of this to exist for so long. He wouldn't have allowed the Virgin Mary to be venerated like she is by so many people, by countless millions over the centuries, unless we're right. So that's the old argument that if everybody's doing it, then let's do it. That makes it right. And that doesn't prove anything at all. We could say for 1,500 years the church didn't believe in the baptism of the Holy Spirit too. But that doesn't mean the Spirit's not valid, or the baptism, or tongues, or healing, or all the other things the church didn't believe for 1,500 years. So that's really not a valid argument. That's a sentimental, emotional argument. We're part of the mother faith. The mother faith for 1,500 years. She couldn't have been deceived by God. But that's the claim of a lot of religious groups, that God's the one that led us to found ourselves and incorporate and denominationalize ourselves, and so surely we must be sent from heaven. The second place they tell us, their arguments would go, that you shouldn't set aside the testimony of hundreds and hundreds of later manuscripts just in favor of a handful of a few early ones. Remember, we told you that the vast majority, 95% of our manuscripts from the New Testament come way later than these early ones that we're talking about, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. The vast majority, you could say almost all of them, are the 10th century and later. And the vast majority of them are Byzantine text type. And then the final argument, that's really not an argument because, well, it says nothing. It's just a statement that cannot be proved by anything at all. And that is, they tell us that the traditional text of the TR is actually older and better, which really they themselves tell us is not true when they tell us that the church has been following this text for only 1,500 years. What about the 400, the 350 years before people started following Byzantine text, or the Textus Receptus, or at least the origins of what later became the Textus Receptus? Now, one thing you want to make a note of is the fact that the TR and the Byzantine text, TR and Byzantine, are not equivalent to one another. We said that the Textus Receptus was a mixed Byzantine text type, because the Byzantine text, its origins and foundations go all the way back to the mid-300s A.D., the middle of the 4th century A.D. That's a long time ago. And yet at the same time, we've said that the Textus Receptus of Erasmus and of the Elzevir brothers and eventually of the KJV, the Textus Receptus is based upon late inferior medieval manuscripts. Now the medieval age was not the 4th century A.D., it's much later than that. So how can both of them be true? Well, it's simply because the Textus Receptus is based in part upon the Byzantine text type. That's why we called it a mixed Byzantine text type. That is the standardized Byzantine text type that came about from the 4th to the 8th century A.D. And then furthermore, it's based upon these late medieval manuscripts. Some of them themselves have come from the Byzantine family, but yet they don't have the same variants as the standardized Byzantine text from the 4th to the 8th century. So TR and Byzantine, we're saying, are not synonymous. They're not totally equivalent with one another. We put them together because the TR is based essentially upon a Byzantine text type. Now, after the deaths of these three men, and most notably J.W. Burgon, B-U-R-G-O-N, after the death of these three men, then we could say that really important scholarly defenses of the TR died out with them, and so did the popularity of the KJV in scholarly circles. A series of books came out about a decade ago. They look all alike. Edited by David Otis Fuller, who's a well-known, staunch advocate of Westcott-Hort and defender of the KJV and Textus Receptus. Here's one that we brought before, Counterfeit or Genuine, Mark 16 and John 8. So it's got the Mark 16 passage and the Pericope de Adultera passage of John chapter 8. However, the whole book, essentially, the whole body of the book is made up, one chapter entitled The Last 12 Verses of the Gospel According to Mark by J.W. Burgon. This is printed from Burgon's work 100 years ago. It's because no one's really been able to say what Burgon did against Westcott and Hort. Then the next chapter is entitled Pericope de Adultera, the woman in adultery of the last verse of John 7, and then the first 10 or 11 verses of John 8, again written by J.W. Burgon. So this is just a revision of what Burgon has already said before. So there's one of the books. Another one entitled True or False. I believe this is a book on Westcott and Hort. The subtitle is The Westcott-Hort Textual Theory Re-Examined. They give us some modern-day work by some scholars. Fuller's really not the one who does all this. Fuller's just the one who edits it. But David Otis Fuller is probably the best-known name today in scholarly circles for defending the KJV. He's got, well, here they print in a small revised form J.W. Burgon's book, the Revision Revised, which I mentioned before. That's this book right here, and it goes on. He wrote 500 pages, I think, on it. So obviously they didn't get it all in here, but they took his major points out. Then the third in the series, entitled Which Bible? Again, you're going to have to choose between Westcott and Hort and their theory and the work of the KJV. Here's some of the chapters. One chapter entitled The Greek Text of the King James Version by Zane C. Hodges. Now, Hodges is another name you might want to get down, along with Fuller, along with Terence Brown, as being three of the most influential people today in favor of the KJV and the TR. You see, you're really an oddity in scholarly circles if you're still trying to defend the TR and the KJV. I mentioned Zane Hodges because he's a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas, and Dallas Seminary does not hold to the view that Hodges does. They hold to the opposite view, but at the same time, Hodges is a professor of theology there, of New Testament, if I remember correctly, at Dallas Theological Seminary. So just because you run across Zane Hodges' name, and if you happen to keep up with reading scholarly things and you know that Hodges is a professor at Dallas, just in case you do that, you don't want to stumble by thinking, well, all of Dallas Seminary is known by these, like Walford, they're known by these great theologians that they have down there, and Charles C. Ryrie and Merle Unger had taught there, and a lot of other things. Just because they're known for these great scholars doesn't mean they hold to the antiquated view of the TR. They talk some about Wilson. Here's a chapter entitled The Magnificent J.W. Burgon. They're still going back to Burgon because he's the one who did more than anyone in defending KJV and TR. Another chapter entitled The Principle and Tendency of the Revision Examined, the Bible in Modern Criticism. Here's a chapter that's composed of selections that have been taken from others' writings. Probably I could turn there and I know it would be Burgon's writings by David Otis Fuller, entitled In Defense of the Textus Receptus. The next chapter entitled Codex Vaticanus and Its Allies. They don't like Codex Vaticanus because it doesn't like Textus Receptus, or the KJV for that matter. Then another chapter towards the end, A Critical Examination of the Westcott-Hort Textual Theory, which means they don't like it. So this book, because it was printed by a publishing company in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and because it's got catchy titles and good printing and it's easy to read, has just been picked up by evangelicals all over the country. You might have a set of them that they really aren't worth having. Now let me say this about the books. Because I've read the books. I've read most of them. I think maybe one of them I haven't gotten into yet. I got them several years ago and haven't spent the time or wanted to take the time to read all of what they had to say. But when you get in there, it looks like you're in the Valley of the Giants, because they just began to bring all of these statistics and facts and manuscript designations and titles and saying, now these are the ones that just overwhelmingly sweep aside Westcott and Hort. And they do so very persuasively and very convincingly. So I hope we've been more persuasive and convincing than they have been, or than they are if you happen to read their work. I want to read from a book that was printed in the late 1970s by D.A. Carson, who's a professor at Trinity Evangelical Seminary in Deerfield, entitled The King James Version Debate, A Plea for Realism. That makes a lot of sense. He gives what he calls his 14 theses concerning the present-day revival by people like Hodges and Terrence Brown and Edward Hills and David Otis Fuller and some others of the positions of J.W. Burgon, F.H.A. Scrivener, and so forth. Where he says, in this chapter, in this book, I shall seek to demonstrate that the interpretation of the evidence by the present-day leaders of the TR movement is misleading and mistaken. Now this is very important, because they give lots and lots of evidence that unless you know what you're doing and know what you're reading, it's easy to be convinced in favor of the KJV and Textus Receptus. Moreover, he says, I shall point out logical fallacies in their exposition and the alarming way, and by the way, maybe you don't know D.A. Carson, but he's a reliable scholar and a reliable author, and point out the alarming way in which they cite arguments in their own favor without examining those arguments. You know, they take things out of context from other manuscripts or from the quotations of patristic writers. Their presuppositions in favor of the TR have made most of them careless about determining the truth of many of their oft-repeated contentions, with the result that not only their interpretation of the facts is incorrect, but also their alleged facts are far too often simply untrue. They've got this little cliche that they use about a certain verse or a certain variant or a certain text, and they've used it so many times that they forget that they dreamed that up themselves and it can't be based on a fact anywhere. And yet they refer to the fact of such and such, and then they give you a conclusion from that fact. And what Carson is saying is not only is the conclusion wrong, but the fact never did exist. It's just that it's been held by people for so long, things about the KJV and how reliable and inerrant and inspired and trustworthy it really is, that people simply never take time to criticize or to think intellectually about the matter. Moreover, here's a little facetious statement of his that I think really sums up what's going on out there by people who are defending TR and KJV. He calls them the group of pamphleteers. You know, they print these little pamphlets on, you know, it's like Chick publications against the Catholic Church. If you've ever read Chick, Chick's got no foundation whatsoever for anything that he says. I mean, he's in lawsuits right now out in California because of what he said about the Catholic Church that simply can't be proved anywhere. He tells about how, you know, he was discovered in some grandmother's attic, you know, an old book that told that this is really true. And yet those things can't be validated. They can't be substantiated at all. So you have to kind of put these people with someone like Chick, who goes about just ranting and raving about things that you can't prove at all. How many of you have read some of Chick's little work? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. Oh, he can make the Catholics look worse than I could. Because he gives facts that I couldn't give because they aren't facts. You know, it'd be good if you could tell, you know, what the personal, private life of every pope was, and you could really show him to be a beast and an antichrist. But that simply can't be done in many cases that some people are trying to do. There's another group over in Minnesota, from what I hear recently, that's in court now because they followed the lead of people like Jack Chick and have printed up these little things against Catholicism that the Catholic Church is very upset about. Well, anyway, I got off on that because Carson refers to these people as those people who just write these little pamphlets. You know, really not a scholarly, in-depth work. They write little pamphlets about watch out for all those critics who deny the virgin birth and the resurrection of Christ and the KJV. You know, they slip that in there at the end as though you could put that with the virgin birth and the resurrection. So you'll see what I mean by what he says. He says most of them are nothing but concerned pastors who believe that the abandonment of the KJV is a sign of the corruption and degeneracy of our critical age. They think that if you deny the virgin birth, the resurrection, the deity of Christ, the inspiration of Scripture, then you also deny the KJV. And if you believe those things, then automatically you believe the KJV because the KJV teaches those things. But so does the NIV and the ASV and the NASB or the NASV, whatever you want to call it. So do those versions as well. And those are based upon the work of Westcott-Hort, not Erasmus and Bonaventure and Abraham and all the rest of them. The most recent book to come out on the subject, in favor we're talking now about the KJV, is one by Wilbur Pickering entitled The Identity of the New Testament Text. And some of these books are really scholarly oddities, novel, bizarre things, because time and time again the KJV and the TR have proven to have been not the best that was available. Now let me give you a few thoughts on where textual criticism stands today with regard to the Westcott-Hort theory. Because you can perhaps recognize from the titles of their four families that things are a little bit different today. Their titles were Western, Alexandrian, Syrian, and Neutral. Today, the titles of the four generally recognized categories or genealogical groups and families of manuscripts are Alexandrian, Western, Caesarean, and Byzantine. Now, under Alexandrian, we have a combination of what Westcott-Hort referred to as Alexandrian and what they referred to as neutral. They tried to make a distinction between the two groups by showing that one originated and derived itself from the other, and really it's not true. Probably they're just the same group. So that takes one out of the four of Westcott-Hort. Alexandrian and neutral combined as one, and it's referred to as the Alexandrian group, and it's generally felt to be the most reliable group. And notice that it contains the two great early uncials, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. The Western family stays the same as theirs as far as title goes. Today it's really more mysterious of a group than it was during the time of Westcott-Hort, and no longer is everyone certain that Delta, Theta, 05, and 06 should really be placed under the Western family. It seems, according to the scholars today, to have had an early origin, however. Then in the third place, the Caesarean family. This is the most significant change from Westcott-Hort in their theory, because the Caesarean family had not even been recognized or discovered then. It was named by B.H. Streeter in his book entitled The Four Gospels, published in 1924. And you see, if you use a name like Streeter, I studied Streeter in New Testament studies in college. Streeter was a liberal in every sense of the word, and so if you mention a name like Streeter, then people want to turn away from the views that are represented under a name like that, such as Alexandrian, Western, Caesarean, Byzantine, the genealogical families. But you don't necessarily need to do that. As I said, it's a text that was unknown to Westcott-Hort. It seems to have been a local text that originated in the city of Caesarea. And it lies somewhere midway between the first two families, Alexandrian and Western, probably closer to the Western family than the Alexandrian. And then finally, the Byzantine family, which is the same as the Syrian family of Westcott-Hort, But the name was simply changed so that this family of manuscripts would not be confused with the Syriac version of the Bible, which is an entirely different subject. So if you call one family the Syrian family, and then you also talk about the Syriac version, then obviously people might confuse the two, and they're two entirely different things. So to help keep confusion down, they changed the name from Syrian to Byzantine. It appears to be the least reliable because it practices some of the errors that we've mentioned before, homoiotoluten, conflation, harmonization, tries to smooth out the rough areas and make things easier, smoother, and better to read, which makes it, obviously, the worst of the families. In order of importance, they probably go as follows: Alexandrian, Caesarean, Western, and Byzantine. And so I think that gives us enough for tonight on Westcott-Hort and TR to stop there. That lets you know where textual criticism is today with regard to TR. As we've been showing you, there is a minor revival based on the works of J.W. Burgon of people going back in favor of the TR, the KJV. But generally the only people that are going to be following that and holding to that are the uneducated sheep of denominationalism who know nothing more or better than the KJV.